Welcome to another Geography Juice video in the Leeds Local History series. In this episode we are in the west end of the city centre, investigating a street with an intriguing history, and as we will see, some unanswered questions. There was once an independent chapel here, complete with its own burial ground. But what happened to the bodies? It's a place where a passionate anti-slavery public meeting was held. Who was the famous speaker? And what about the talk of tunnels under the street? Queen Street is located between Wellington Street and Park Square in the commercial district west of Leeds City Square. It's been around for over 200 years. In 1815 it was open land to the south of Park Place, and Queen Street was yet to come. But within 2 years Wellington Street was laid out, and King Street and Queen Street were added, forming a rectangle and available for construction. Seizing upon the opportunity were the Methodist congregation hitherto assembling at the Whitechapel in Hunslet Lane, who built their new chapel here on the northwest side of Queen Street. The congregation of the Whitechapel was already supposed to have moved once to the newly built Salem Chapel in 1791. However, a group of worshippers had remained at the Whitechapel, and in 1819 the Rev Thomas Scales became their pastor. Thomas Scales was a mover and a shaker. By April 27, 1825, the Queen Street Congregational Chapel was completed and available for worship. And it wasn't just any old chapel. It was the largest independent chapel in the north of England at that time. It included under one roof accommodation for 1,250 people, with an upper gallery for 400. There were 2 lofty schoolrooms, capable of educating 700 children, 2 vestries, and a large committee room. Not only that, there was a large cemetery also surrounding it. Thomas Scales was a community leader, a founder of Silcote School for the education of the sons of independent ministers and missionaries. He was also a passionate supporter of the anti-slavery movement. On July 24, 1843, a public meeting of the Leeds Anti-Slavery Society was held in the Queen Street Chapel, and it is said that the Reverend J.W.C. Pennington attended and addressed the meeting. Pennington was an American abolitionist, orator and minister who was born into slavery and is the first known black student to attend Yale University. Sadly, despite its impressive size and important past, the Queen Street Congregational Chapel was marked for demolition in 1936. This photo was taken on Little Queen Street just months before the chapel was demolished in the December of that year. It was part of a plan to build a 120-foot wide boulevard between Park Place and Westgate. Unfortunately, it was a plan that never came to fruition, possibly parked because of the Second World War. To add insult to injury, the land that the chapel had stood on was simply turned into a car park for the increasing population of motor cars in the city. At this point you might be thinking, hang on, didn't he say there was a large cemetery surrounding the chapel? What happened to that? Well, although the chapel was demolished, it was another year before permission was granted by the Home Office to exhume the buried bodies and to move them elsewhere. 86 in total. Some of them had been buried for over 100 years, all reburied at Hare Hill Cemetery. There is no trace of the Congregational Chapel today, though one feature in the photograph taken in 1936 remains on Queen Street, and it is the source of many rumours. Once you start getting involved in the history of Leeds City Centre, then it isn't long before you come across stories of tunnels running here and there across the area. Some of them fact, and some of them fiction. Could this be the air vent to some underground tunnel? Well, it certainly is an air vent, and there is another nearby on Northern Street. Queen Street is in the background of this shot. Whether there is a tunnel below that people can access, I'm not sure. If you know more about this, do please comment below. Electric lighting arrived in Leeds in around 1880. The electric lighting company was appointed in 1882 and lighting was installed in the town hall in 1883 with other municipal buildings following. A permanent electricity supply was started from Whitehall Road in 1893 and the town hall was connected to this in 1895. The air vents provided cooling to the supply cables in this newly emerging industry. We can speculate about the exact route that the cables ran and whether there are tunnels, but they certainly headed to a substation near to Park Lane. And this is the substation in 1939, designed with a Georgian look to emulate the buildings on Summer Street and Park Square. Incredibly, the substation still exists today, although the building is no longer used for its original purpose, and it is now offices. Queen Street is a diverse collection of buildings, many with a commercial past. The railway stations built on the south side of Wellington Street between 1846 and 1854 led to a number of warehouses being built to take advantage of the new transport connections. Apsley House, on the corner of Queen Street and Wellington Street, is one of many former warehouse buildings in this part of Leeds, which have since been converted to office use. It was built in 1903 by the architect George Corson and others, and was originally named Concourse House, but is now named after the Duke of Wellington's London home. George Corson was responsible for many buildings in Leeds, including other warehouse buildings on Wellington Street. It was constructed for Crowe & Co, wholesale drapery, haberdashery, boot manufacturers and warehouse men. For many years it was soot-laden, but since it has been cleaned up, the wonderful pink terracotta and red brick facade is back on display. It was one of the last buildings with which George Corson was associated, and he died in 1910. Another wonderful warehouse on Queen Street is Monarch House, built in the 1920s, although a part of the building adopted in the construction to the rear is older, built in 1881. It was initially the warehouse of James Hare Limited, woolen warehouseman, and the large windows allowed the light to flood in. It's a lovely looking building. Alongside of it is Coronet House, built within a few years of Monarch House, but with a clear difference in style, reflecting the architectural changes taking place during the 20th century, and also because it was built as offices rather than a warehouse. In 1940 it was the offices of Shell Mex and BP, as well as the Ministry of Labour. There is a habit of giving buildings a royal name on Queen Street. We've already met Monarch House and Coronet House. This is Regent House, a new building taking up the corner with Wellington Street. The City Temperance Hotel was here at the start of the 20th century, run by Mrs. Eliza Oxley. It was still here in 1940 and run by Miss Barbara Thompson. This city street has seen a good deal of change, and many older buildings have been replaced. Further along the west side of Queen Street we have other newer buildings with royal name connections, such as Elizabeth House and Prince William House, built in 1983. This recently had a further 2 new floors added and an updated look. At the end, Q2, another link to royalty, is a recent residential development on the spot where Darley House had stood since 1937. Prior to that, Chapel Court was here, which was a collection of small dwellings. Surprisingly perhaps, there hasn't ever been a high population of people dwelling on Queen Street. In 1901, for example, there were less than 20 people staying overnight in the census. These mid-Victorian houses are some of the earliest buildings on the street, but they were soon converted to offices and workshops, although the censuses show people have lived in them. For much of their life, reflecting the true mix of land uses in this area, opposite them stood a timber yard, complete with traversing crane. With recent changes in the road layout and traffic flow, Queen Street is now very quiet at times. In the past it was a two-way street and buses used to run along this route, but not anymore. People mill about during office hours, but it can be much quieter on other occasions. New developments being created in the city centre may be drawing people away. Queen Street can be a little overlooked. What is certain, however, is that this is a street with a very interesting past that is clearly linked with the growth of Leeds. Thankfully, despite a great deal of new development and the introduction of some buildings with little architectural elegance, a few reminders of this past still remain. If you have enjoyed this video, check out the other Leeds local history videos on the Geography Juice channel. Thank you for watching.